So Faith, firstly, thank you so much for joining us. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Faith Abraham. I'm a TOEFL and IELTS exam tutor certified by the London Teacher Training College and ETS with about 6 years of English language teaching experience. Additionally, I'm an academic writing coach and I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And really great to have you here as well. So, yeah, and please could you tell us a little bit about why you got into English teaching? How did you start? And why did you think about specializing in exams?
Sure. When I first started teaching English in 2014, my main goal was to help students develop their knowledge of the language and become fluent. I started by conducting speaking clubs or conversational classes at different language schools. However, after some of those speaking clubs, some students usually come up to me with questions related to grammar, which had to do with grammatical structures or collocations. And instead of just answering them, well, that's how it's done in English without any concrete explanation to their questions, I decided to go find out why and how certain sentences are structured in a particular way. I underwent a TOEFL training offered by the London Teacher Training College. Somewhere along the line, I decided to venture into preparing students for the IELTS and TOEFL exams based on the increasing demand for teachers in these fields at the language schools I worked with, and of course, individual coaching. So I underwent an IELTS teachers training offered by the London Teacher Training College and a TOEFL training offered by the ETS. When I began my work, I immediately noticed a negative trend that most of the students coming to me had issues to deal with the writing section. They might have had, a lot of them had taken the test prior to coming to me, and the lowest section or the lowest band they had was in the writing section. And in order to help them improve their levels in this field, I decided to undergo academic writing courses offered by the University of Queensland and Andre Clapper. The courses have been quite effective and have helped me significantly improve my students' level.
Brilliant. And I mean, amazing experience and really well-rounded about exams, and interesting story to hear how you started. And I'm just looking through the chat now. We've got people here from Poland, from Dubai, Malaysia, Colombia, France, Italy. Really amazing to see everybody here. Egypt, really fantastic. So welcome everybody. And obviously as well, Faith, you've been tutoring students through Preply as well. And how did you start with Preply? What has your experience been like so far?
Well, when I started working on Preply in 2016, my main goal was to move my services fully online. In my personal opinion, for a private tutor, it is more efficient to work online. This is because in my case, for each hour lesson at a student resident or at a school, I lose 3 hours. 1 hour to go to the student's residence, and 1 hour to conduct the lesson, and 1 hour to return home. So Preply gave me a platform to realize my goals. Initially, of course, it was a little bit challenging since I had to spend a couple of months without having any student. However, immediately I got the first student, my story completely changed after the student left a positive review. And this is one piece of advice I would like to give to new tutors on the platform. There is so much competition on Preply. So you really have to take time, follow the instructions or the pieces of advice given to you by the admin to improve your profile score, and hope that someday, a student or two could reach out to you and you might have a chance to establish yourself on the platform itself.
Yeah, and since then, Faith, you've taken over 2,400 lessons, I think, with English learners on Preply, and really incredible. And here's what some of the reviews have said, that you've helped them get their IELTS score that they needed, that you've been able to prepare them for the exams, that you're overall great English tutor, and it's important to find your own tutor. And I think this is in general, a great tip. So guys, in the chat, I'm going to share Faith's profile. If you're interested to take a lesson with Faith or a trial lesson at any point, feel free to click through and check out his profile, and you can book a lesson on there. Sure. So now we know a little bit more about Faith. Let's learn all about English exams with his top 10 tips. So we'll go through these one at a time, but we'll also share a document with all of the tips and the resources we've spoken about at the end of the webinar. So stick around for that. That's quite important. So don't forget, if you have any questions about these tips, drop them in the chat and we will try to answer them as we move through each one. So first of all, we'll be looking at 6 tips for preparing before the exam. So the first one is really, really early in the stage of the process, and it's super important. So that's to identify the test you need before it's too late. So Faith, what do you mean by before it's too late? Why would it be too late?
It's essential to know which tests you need to take because the purposes of the test vary. TOEFL is mainly for academic purposes. IELTS is divided into the general and academic tests. The general is mainly for work and immigration purposes, whereas the academic is for educational purposes. The distinctions between the two types are in the writing and reading sections. Now, some students register for one and start preparing, and later on realize that they should be going for the other. I've had students like that. Make sure you are going for the right one and not waste your effort. And one particular thing I would like to note is that sometimes some organizations may have some specific requirements which override the purpose of the test. For instance, you may be required to take the academic test even though you are immigrating to another country or you are going to another country for work-related functions. Based on my experience, such is prevalent in the UK in the nursing sphere. I had a student who wanted to go to the UK to work as a nurse, and we spent a lot of time preparing for the IELTS general test. However, 1 week prior to the exam, he discovered that it's clearly stated on the website that you have to take the academic test. By that time, it was virtually too late because he only had a week left, and preparing for the academic test takes longer than preparing for the general test. So in order to avoid such, you have to make sure you know which test you are going for.
Really important. Of course, preparing and understanding the tests as well, what they are and why you would take each test is really, really key. And I see my colleague Millie has just shared a blog post all about the difference between IELTS and TOEFL, and I think that's a really great resource. So guys, let us know as well in the chat, are you planning to take an English test now or in the future? Have you booked one perhaps? Let us know, and yeah, let's see if we can help you before you get started. So let's move on to tip 2. And this is get acquainted with the specific rules and structures of your test. So have you experienced some students, going into the test unprepared?
Sure, right. Some students make the huge mistake of going to the test without knowing how it's done, the structures, and the rules. For instance, one sat during the listening section expecting the audio to be played twice. While I understand that such is possible when you are preparing, you should know that when you go for the test, such is not possible. And of course, if you didn't take notes, there would be no way you could answer. Maybe from your memory, of course, your memory could help you, but you would be in for a shock if you don't read the rules or the every other requirement that the test requires you to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely not good to, wait for that shock moment, and be prepared, guys. So for everyone watching as well, let us know if you've taken an English test before and what your experience was like. Do you have any difficult stories like Faith is talking about right now, or funny stories about your exams, mistakes? Let us know if you've come across any of these or had these before. So let's move on to, in the meantime, let's talk about our next tip. So to know the band or score you need and set a realistic timeline to prepare for it. So Faith, how much time would an exam taker need to prepare for their test?
Well, that's a general question because, first of all, you need to know the score or band you need so you don't overestimate your expectations. Knowing the score or band you need gives you an idea of the timeline you need for preparations. This will enable you to work at your own pace with minimum pressure. And of course, you'll find yourself in the best condition for learning. For an advanced level student, that is a C1 or C2 level student, it doesn't take much time. A couple of weeks or a month or two should suffice. However, it may take longer for lower levels. And it's not advisable, right, to prepare for the test when you have any level below the intermediate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see here in the chat, we've got people preparing for these tests as we speak. So we have Anna, she says IELTS, she's got the IELTS in 2 weeks and she looks like she's sweating. Don't worry, Anna, you're going to do great. We've also, who else have we got here? We have more people in the chat. Next year, Hamza said to do the IELTS. Good luck, Hamza. Let us know if you need any help at all on Preply, and we'll be able to help you with that. So let's move on swiftly to tip 4. So we talked a little bit about setting a realistic timeline and having a good understanding of your current level of English. So that's where I think our next tip comes in, to know your current level and then identify your gaps and how to work on them. So how can people start to identify their gaps, as you call them?
Yes. Well, to identify your gaps, you need to take a test that covers all aspects of English and your exam. That is grammar, listening, writing, speaking, and reading. This is important because it helps you to determine how and where to start. A tutor could only do so much to help you. A tutor might dedicate an hour or two maximum in a day to help you improve your level of English language knowledge or to prepare you for the exam. More depends on the student. By knowing your gaps, you know what to work on. And you should find some exercises in English, maybe any exercises that relates to the exam fields, improve, work on the skills you need to develop. You may watch movies, get exposure to the language as much as possible. Watch movies, listen to music, watch cartoons if you're a fan of cartoons like me, or you may read essays if you're interested in improving your writing skills, or if you're interested in developing your vocabulary, you may find interest in reading newspapers or books to develop such skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Great tip as well to watch cartoons. I love that one because, unashamed to say I'm a fan of cartoons myself. I watch them quite a lot. So let's see what else we've got here. So I think there are so many ways to expose yourself to a language, like you mentioned already, Faith. And I would like to know from our audience, what are your favorite ways to practice English while you're alone? So I'm going to set up a poll. You will see a poll in front of you now. And let's see what you think. And if there are other answers, other favorite ways that you have, feel free to add them in the chat. And let's see what everyone likes to do and how everyone likes to learn. So it's also worth keeping this in mind because in our next webinar, we're going to talk all about learning English from home. And it's with a special guest speaker who we've got coming up. So look out for your reminder email and we'll talk more about how to make these more effective. So we have watch TV or videos in here. Yep, I love to watch YouTube as well. I'm learning Spanish myself. So I watch a lot of YouTube videos in Spanish, reading books or articles. Reading books is really, really effective. I find it as well. Great. So great to see what everyone likes here. So let's move on. So the 5th tip is determine whether you need an individual coach or a school. So Faith, could you tell us a little bit of the key differences between the two?
Most definitely. Well, based on how the teaching system is structured, undergoing the IELTS or TOEFL training courses is not an extension of learning English, but those courses are designed to help students acquire the skills necessary to pass the test.
Hmm.
Therefore, if you have any gaps, it will not be advisable for you to go to a language school where you'll be placed in groups. You might be rushed and never get the best out of your training. And furthermore, the teachers there do not necessarily have the knowledge of teaching English grammar. Why? Because their focus is on transmitting you the skills necessary to pass the test and not to teach you English. On the other hand, learning with a coach, such an individual coach, such as myself, is best for students with gaps. This is because it is personal and has to do with the teacher's reputation.
Hmm.
Individual coaches will dedicate their attention to you alone and might work on improving your general English language knowledge and delivering you the skills you need to pass the test. They are more goal and result oriented and are keen on seeing your progress.
Hmm.
Of course, that is because it has to do with their reputation.
Exactly. I was just thinking that. I mean, it's very important. Like like you say that their results, your students' results, are your results as well. It's a very personal thing because you want to see them do well. As a personal coach, you know, you might feel pride that one of your students has got the band they need and potentially change their life in whatever way they see. And a school just has lots and lots of different students and can't give that focus. I think is a great point. We've had a good question come in that says, "I have a question. Do you think IELTS is better than TOEFL? What's your opinion on that, Faith?"
Hmm, I can't really say that IELTS is better than TOEFL. I would say it just depends on what the purpose of taking the exam.
Hmm.
And for instance, based on my experience, I noticed that some countries do accept the IELTS and some do not, while some prefer the TOEFL. For academic purposes, TOEFL should suffice, but for immigration and academic purposes, the IELTS may be acceptable. For instance, I don't know if there's any specific link between Canada and IELTS, but Canada accepts more of IELTS than TOEFL. So I wouldn't give preference to any, but based on my experience, I would say that the TOEFL it's a little bit more difficult than the IELTS. So
Hmm.
of course, others may have different opinions.
Hmm. Exactly. I think it really depends what you need it for. Is pretty key there. Um, got some more questions in. Maria asked if I've already taken the test, will I be able to take it again?
Most definitely, you can always take the test again.
Hmm.
However, well, I know that after the pandemic, uh, you might be able to take the test much more frequently than it was in the time past. So in the time past, it might take a couple of months before you retake the test, but I think now it's possible to even retake it after a couple of days. I know that for the TOEFL test.
Hmm. Great, perfect. So no worries, Maria. You can take the test again. It's yeah, not a problem.
Sure.
So let's move on to our next tip. And of course, guys, we'll come back to your questions. I've made sure to save them. So yeah, don't worry, we'll focus on them. And the next step is to focus on your skill, the development of your skills over time and to avoid cramming. So I remember cramming before my maths exam, my maths GCSE, and it didn't work. It didn't work very well. I came out with some pretty poor results. So, how can test takers, exam takers, develop their self-learning? In what ways that can they teach themselves over time?
Well, talking about cramming, while it may be helpful if you know what you're cramming and are only doing that to retain memory, right? Cramming what you don't really know might put you under pressure
Hmm.
and may not be all that helpful because there's that high tendency that you may apply it incorrectly. And of course, it would lead to you being marked down by your tutors. To avoid this, of course, you need to prepare well in advance. Like we mentioned earlier, you need to set a time frame for preparations and timeline for each activity you do. Divide your task into chunks and work on them. Develop your skills over time. And when the exam time comes, you wouldn't have the necessity to cram since you're well prepared.
Yeah, great advice to make sure to set a really good plan. And yeah, Millie, who's on my team, Millie, we have an article about called a study planner, and I think it would be great if you could share it in the chat. That might be able to help people out as well to plan for their exams. I'm just looking back at the questions here as well. One of them is about speaking. So I know we're going to get to speaking very shortly, but Julia asked, is accent important in passing and preparing for the exam? Is it a problem to prepare for IELTS when tutor has American accent and vice versa?
Worry less about your accent. The most important thing is to be understood. So focus on that, develop the clarity of your speech. Once you're understood, once you're understood, that should be enough to get you the band you need. And that is what the examiner is looking for. The examiner is not looking for you to have a beautiful British accent, American, Canadian, whichever. The most important thing is to be understood clearly.
Exactly. And I think we have a guest for the next webinar as well that mentions connection, not perfection. And I think this is a very good quote to keep in mind. To make yourself understood and not to be so worried about every little thing about how you speak. Right. So we've got the 6 tips about preparing for the exam. So let's move on to the day of the exam. So there's lots of things that happen on the day of the exam. And if you followed all of Faith's advice beforehand, you should be on a good path to success and a good result. So preparation is really important, but there are also some really important things to remember on the day of the exam. So our next tip, it kind of links to our previous tip. So if you prepare well, then you should feel quite relaxed, but your mind is very important to take care of. So you need to remember, relax. It's only a test. So this is good advice for any challenge in life, really. But what's some advice, Faith, about how they can relax before the test?
Sure. Some people panic too much about exams, so they become nervous on the day of taking it. This actually may inhibit you from clearly expressing yourself or expressing your thoughts before an examiner on the day of the exam, particularly in the IELTS speaking exam, since you do it before an examiner, unlike in the TOEFL test where you have the possibility to do the speaking section in the computer base or before an examiner in the paper-based test. So when it comes to being calm on the day of the exam and relaxing yourself, in my own case, I generally don't read on the day of any exams. And I conclude my preparations a day before the exam and work onto the exam center listening to some calm music. I don't do reviews, I don't do revisions on the day of the exam. However, to adopt such a strategy, you would need to be well prepared. Otherwise, you might not be helping yourself doing that. I don't know how others do it, but that's how I do it. I don't try to read anything that has to do with the exam and keep myself relaxed and try to take my mind fully off the examination I'm going to take.
Yeah, great advice. I think giving some space between your preparation and the day of the exam is really useful. And everyone in the chat, everyone watching, perhaps you can also share some ways that you keep calm in situations like before an exam or before a difficult moment or before a big challenge in your life. So what music do you listen to? Do you listen to music? Do you watch a movie? I would be interested to know how you guys keep calm in situations like that. Meanwhile, let's talk a little bit about the actual exam itself. So listening and reading sections. So the tip is to pay close attention to what each question requires you to do. So what tricks do people have to watch out for in the listening and the reading sections?
Well, you're right. You have to pay attention to the requirements of each question. What does the question require you to do? Is it to identify the main ideas, the topic, the context, the purpose of a text or lecture, or the writer's opinion, or maybe the writer's attitude? Now, in order to understand the writer's attitudes towards a particular topic, you have to pay attention to the intonation. Sorry. For the writer, you have to pay attention to the text, of course, but when it comes to the listening section, you have to pay attention to the intonation of the lecturer or the person speaking. So that means you have to pay attention to each and every detail mentioned, the tone that the speaker uses in the speech. And furthermore, when it comes to the listening section, you have to also take into note that you don't have the possibility to skip questions. That is why it's highly important to take good notes. If you don't have good notes, then you may have some issues. When answering the questions, you don't have the possibility to go back. On the other hand, when it comes to the reading section, you have the possibility to answer some of the questions, and if you're not sure about any, you may proceed and later on go back and answer the questions. And moreover, the audio record in the listening section is only played once, so you have to take this into consideration. We mentioned this earlier, so you don't get any surprises on the day of the exams. And finally, like we mentioned earlier, about accents. Generally, the accents in the listening section are pretty clear here. However, you may need to familiarize yourself with British, American, Australian, or New Zealand accent if you're not really familiar with these accents, or you have problems understanding them. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think, listening, really being present, really being in the moment, and making sure that you listen very closely is super important, not being distracted. But also, and I'm going to share in the chat as well, there is a tool that is called Youglish, and you can use this, guys. I think it's a very good tool to listen to how certain words or sentences are spoken in different English accents across the world. So American accents, Canadian accents, Australian, as Faith already mentioned. And this will get you used to and accustomed to different accents in English. And I'm just looking through the chat right now, and I can see many people sharing numbers for WhatsApp as well. I think this is great because obviously you can communicate, you can practice your English, and you have kind of like partnerships to help you practice. And this is always really useful. So big thumbs up from me, guys. Okay, so next we're talking about the speaking section. So the tip is to use tenses other than present simple or continuous. So I think it's great advice. It shows that you have a complex knowledge, understanding of English. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit about how you would do that in the test?
Yes, of course. I would like to start by giving a question. How do you expect to get an IELTS band 7 and above, or a TOEFL score of 90 and above, when you can only make sentences using the present simple or present continuous? So here I would like to draw your attention to the fact that if you would like to get a high score in any of these tests, you should be able to use complex sentences, vary your tenses, and of course, you should be able to use advanced grammar. While I understand that the general idea is that no one fails the speaking section of the TOEFL or IELTS exams, this is generally because when you come for the exams, you generally have an intermediate level. However, if you would like to get anything beyond a band 6 and TOEFL score of 90 and above, you need to be able to use sentences of varying structures advanced grammar, make complex sentences, and not
Mm-hmm.
only limit yourself to the use of the present simple, present continuous. You should be able to make sentences using perfect tenses, perfect continuous tenses where applicable, and of course, conditional statements.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And what about interacting with the test taker and the examiner? What do you say? What are your tips around that? Because I think when you're in an exam, you're nervous, but it might be good to have a good rapport with the person in front of you. Am I right?
Most definitely. If you are taking the test, treat the examiner as a friend. Look cheerful and smile.
Mm-hmm.
This might ease the nervousness and create a friendly atmosphere for the both of you. And
Mm-hmm.
as we mentioned earlier, do not really worry about your accent. Focus on clarity and being understood, and that should
Mm-hmm.
work.
Exactly. I mean, just to create an engaging conversation. We don't need perfect English. It'd be great to vary the different types of English that you're using, the different tenses and so on. But as we've said, it's important to connect.
Sure.
Okay, so we're coming towards our final tip before we move to the Q&A. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you guys another question just to check your knowledge. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the most difficult part of the TOEFL or IELTS exams? Maybe some people who have already taken these exams can also answer and give their opinion, because they might have found a particular section more difficult than the other. So let's see where we are right now. Okay, so it looks like writing is in the lead. Looks like people have been listening very closely. That writing is the trickiest part, but also speaking is right up there, and I think that's also a part where people struggle quite a lot. But you guys are right. Well done. It is the writing section. So let's move on to the writing section now. So the tip is to use academic English. Now, this is, the trickiest section. So Faith, you've specialized in it. You've done a lot of work on this part of the IELTS and TOEFL exams. So let us know your tips about using academic English to pass the exam.
Uh, sure. Just a second. All right. So yes, talking about the writing section, this is my niche. I specialize in academic English, and like I mentioned earlier, I decided to undergo a course in this field due to the fact that I saw a lot of students having issues with this particular section. The tip is to use academic English. Now, to pass this section, you need to use the academic writing style of English. Let's discuss the two types of tests in the writing section. First, we'll deal with the IELTS test. So the IELTS test is divided into, talking about the IELTS General. First of all, the IELTS General Part 1, you need to be able to write a letter of different types: formal, semi-formal, and informal. Whereas for the academic, you need to describe main features in a diagram or a graphical representation, such as bar charts or pie charts. In some cases, you may be required to describe a process, such as, for example, how milk is processed into cheese. Both types, that is the the IELTS writing section, require you to write an essay in the part 2, whether you're taking the academic or the IELTS general test. In the TOEFL test part 1, you need to relate a lecture. A lecture is an audio record to a reading passage. Uh, you need to show the relationship between the lecture and the reading passage. Part 2 of the test requires you to choose a position while writing an essay. And we have further tips relating to the writing section. You really have to pay attention to this. And the first of them all is to paraphrase the questions and information in the reading passage. This shows your understanding and ability to reproduce the text without plagiarism. Like we mentioned here, we are using academic English, and in academic English, you have to try your best. to avoid any kind of plagiarism. That is why you being able to reproduce the same text or questions using your own words shows your ability to freely communicate the same ideas and also your understanding. And the second thing to note is that your writing style should guide the reader through your essay. Give a roadmap. What's your essay doing? What points will be discussed? Use reporting verbs. This is particularly important in the TOEFL Part 1 test. Use the correct linking and transition words. This requirement cannot be overemphasized. Why? Because in academic English, you have to guide the reader. There is a general way essays are structured. And by reading your text, I should know where you're going to. And how do you do that? You guide the reader using linking and transition words.
So could you give us a couple of examples of these transition words, linking words?
Sure. For instance, linking words might include the use of meanwhile, first, second, third, to begin with, lastly, and so on. And for example, we have a question here, sorry, a statement which relates to the use of linking words. You also have to make sure that you apply the linking words correctly. Otherwise, you might be marked down. For instance, we have an example here. Most research in this field has almost identical results. Meanwhile, a study by Mark 2019 had a different outcome. The linking word used above or just mentioned is incorrect in this context. Why? Because the speaker or the writer, sorry, wants to show contrast. And it would be better in this case to use words like in contrast, on the contrary, or conversely. So it's significant to know the linking words you're using and how to apply them correctly.
So it's all about making your argument and the words you would use, these linking words to make your argument. Like you said, I think it's a very good example. And I'm going to actually share it in the chat. The quote that you said before was meanwhile. So we have meanwhile, a study by Mark 2019 had a different outcome. But you said to change this. So to change it from meanwhile to conversely or on the contrary or in contrast.
Sure.
Am I right with that? Okay. So I've just shared it in the chat as well.
Yes. Two more things relating to the using the academic style in what we just mentioned, the B part, is that you must avoid beginning your sentences with and using sentence fragments. Make sure your sentences are full. Well, in conversational English, spoken English, we could begin sentences with and. You should avoid that when you write an essay. The final point is to make use of complex sentence structures and advanced grammar where necessary. We discussed about that in the speaking section, and again, it pops up here. So, where applicable, use varying tenses from simple to perfect and conditionals. Conditionals here, we mean the zero conditional, first, second, or third conditional. And this indicates your ability to express yourself freely in the language and gives you a chance to have a high score in your test. And when we mention use of advanced grammar or advanced vocabulary, we don't try to say that you should try to over-impress. For example, talking about advanced vocabulary, right? Try to use words in their natural context. We understand that, well, your lexicon or your vocabulary is quite rich. However, try your best to make sure you limit everything to a natural context. Let me give an example where you may use a word inappropriately or in a situation where it wouldn't be natural. For instance, we are dealing with a topic about child discipline, and you decide to write parents should be able to discipline their offspring. Offspring here sounds really weird because we're talking about the immediate children of these parents. So you should make sure you use words in a natural context that is used in everyday English.
Yeah, offspring. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend using that quite often. It's a great word, but in this context, yeah, try to avoid it.
Sure.
Excellent. So I think there are so many tips that we could share about the writing section. There is so much to cover there, and uh, Faith, as he already mentioned, specializes in this completely. I've shared his bio before, and I'll share it again in the chat. If you guys want to speak to Faith further about the writing section, speaking section, whatever section you feel that you need to work on with the IELTS. So that concludes all of our tips. So these are the top 10 English exam tips from Faith. And so if you're looking actually to improve your English and pass the exam as well, there are lots of tutors as well as Faith that you can book a lesson with and level up and get where you want to go with English, get the results that you need, and potentially change your life in whatever circumstance you need for. So with Faith and with any of these tutors, we're offering 50% off for the first lesson. So if you're completely new to Preply, you can find a tutor through this link that we've just shared. So Faith, thanks a lot for your tips. I want to get to some of the questions that we have now that we haven't got to yet in the chat. So let's have a look at what we have here. So Hassan said, how to improve your vocabulary? I think this is a huge question. There are many different ways, I think, Faith.
Most definitely. Well, to improve your vocabulary, you have to do a lot of reading. Okay, you can read newspapers, you can read books, and of course, you could also improve your vocabulary simply by watching movies. What movies interest you? What fields of study interest you? Talking about these exams as well, it's quite important to have knowledge of environmental vocabulary, everything that has to do with the environment. Whether you are dealing with the IELTS test or the TOEFL test, you can't avoid questions that have to deal with the environment. Make sure you are quite conversant with vocabulary in this field. They might really help you.
Yeah, great advice. I think in general as well, people were talking about the environment all the time. So these are also great vocabulary to learn for conversations, interesting conversations. So Rafaela asked, which test is best suited for someone who wants to become a teacher?
Who wants to become a teacher? I would say the TOEFL test, because it's mainly academic in nature. So when preparing for it, you really immerse yourself in the process and you get everything necessary for an academic setting. Of course, you also get that when taking the IELTS academic, but based on the demand in the TOEFL section, I would say I would always prefer the TOEFL test when it comes to academy, because you really have to do a lot in this field. Yes.
Great. And so more questions. Again, guys, if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I've just saved all of the questions from before and I'm coming back to them for those who are still with us, such as Ahmad. So Ahmad has asked us, can I retake a section from the TOEFL to increase the score instead of retaking the whole of exam?
I'm afraid it's not possible. You have to take the entire exam. However, recently, TOEFL has made a provision for you to use your previous TOEFL exam scores. This is called the TOEFL My Best score. So however, that is only possible for, I can't really say the timeline, but maybe within the last 2 years or maybe a couple of months. It's possible for you to use 2 TOEFL exams or 3, and the higher scores you get in each of these exams will be recorded in the TOEFL My Best. And that might be helpful if you really need to show knowledge of one level above what you only show in one of the tests. However, you have to be careful because not all organizations accept my best score.
Mm-hmm. Great. And one more as well from Hodan. I hope I'm getting your name right. Sorry if I'm butchering it. So could you give me advice? He says for speaking for the IELTS exam, we gave you some tips as well, but he says he has a lot of mistakes. So yeah, do we have any advice for him?
Well, you have to do a lot of practice and find a teacher that is interested in seeing you improve in this field. A teacher that is willing to stop you and point out all the mistakes you make. And of course, like we mentioned, you have to get exposure to the language. Once you are fully immersed in the language, some things generally just sound incorrect to your ears when you say them inappropriately. So get more exposed to the language. There's that high tendency that you will just feel when you make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to have a tutor that is willing to point out all your mistakes and give you some exercises to do to improve.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think that's one benefit I've had from having a Spanish tutor is I have someone who, if I'm speaking Spanish with a group of people, they might point out my mistake and laugh at me, or even don't even mention my mistakes. But my tutor will note it, write it down, and maybe at the end of the class, say, okay, I'm setting you some homework because I've seen you making the same mistakes over and over again. And this is really, really useful for me to improve and see where I'm going wrong. So I think it's great advice to get another perspective from someone else entirely.
Sure.
So I will just get to the last question because I'm just being cautious about time here as well. And is it possible to get from 5.5 to 7 in 1 year is the question.
From 5.5 to 7. By 7, do you mean the overall score or the score for one section? I would say generally it's possible. From 5.5, most likely that is pre-intermediate, then to 7, which is most likely upper intermediate or beginning C1 level. If you are able to dedicate a lot of time preparing for the test, that is possible. However, if you could only dedicate an hour or two in a week, I'm not sure you could get the result you really want. Like we mentioned earlier, it's all about preparation. You divide the task into chunks. When you identify your gaps, you should be able to work on them. Then there's such possibility. Yes, it's feasible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about breaking it down. And I think this also links to another question that we have from Rafaela to say, do I have to practice every skill every day? In other words, study listening, reading, writing, and speaking daily. So what's your opinion on this?
I would say do what works best for you. Sometimes dividing your attention may not really help. However, if fully concentrating on one thing really helps you, then I would advise you to focus on one thing. Afterwards, when you are fully sure that you have grasped that, you can move to the other one. For example, when students come to me with problems with the writing section, our first focus is on the writing section. And afterwards, we deal with the other sections. When we complete everything, then we could have a general overview. So you may also adopt such approach. However, if it's possible for you to mix everything, then you could also divide them into chunks, listening, writing, speaking, grammar, dedicate specific time for each of these sections daily and work them out.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think it's a great tip. Figure out what works best for you and overall what you enjoy doing, right? And if you enjoy reading, figure out what book, and maybe I'll read a chapter here. And then the next day, for my listening, I'll listen to a great podcast. So it's all about varying. And I think it's a great advice to plan ahead and chunk things. Right. So I'm just going to share a handout, guys. Again, you can see it in the resources section, in the handout section. this is all of the tips that we've shared throughout the webinar, and including some extra bonus tips for other things that we've mentioned throughout. The planner, the study planner, maybe a playlist for the day of the exam for you to chill out and relax. There are all sorts of tips in there that can come in useful for before the exam and the day of the exam. So that's all that we have time for today. And Faith, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge about everything to do with English exams and more. It was really a pleasure to learn with you and from you today.
Thank you too. It's my pleasure.
Great. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope the tips came in useful for English exams. So you will get this recording to visit anytime after the end of the entire series. So the next episode is at the end of the month, and it's about learning English by yourself with some great tips about self-study and how you can improve by yourself. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Sure.